It's Joshua Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And this is the Samsung Galaxy S7. Now, as is the case these days, you can also find a full written detailed review at androidauthority.com that will go through all of the specs and also give the opinion of Nirav Gondia and my own. You can also find picture galleries of the phone so you can see it in all its glory and camera samples of the Samsung Galaxy S7 right here. And you can also find a bunch of benchmarks because we tested the Snapdragon 820 version with the Exynos 8890 version. Speaking of those processors, why don't we go ahead and get all of the specs out of the way first. Well, Samsung have finally done it. They have perfected their design language. Taking the same metal frame and the dual glass panels from last year with the Galaxy S6, they have further refined the design and now have made one of the most accessible phones ever. The 5.1-inch screen size really helps with the handling, but the bezels on the sides are also very respectable. But it's really those curves on the back of the phone that make all of the difference. The phone just sits so beautifully in the hand, and it's really easy to maneuver around, especially with one hand. Going left to right with the phone is really easy, and then minimal hand gymnastics are needed in order to get to the top. Pretty much all of the elements are about the same here. You have the home button up front that has the fingerprint reader embedded underneath that is also a little bit more flush with the body. But it's really the camera on the back that's no longer protruding out so much that really shows just how more sleek this phone is than last year. The phone is about a millimeter narrower from last year's Galaxy S6, but it is also about a millimeter thicker. Now that is to make room for the curve on the back, but also in order to provide room for the 3000 mAh battery underneath. Especially considering everything that this phone is capable of doing, it's great that the body, the first thing you see of this phone, happens to be really attractive. And then you get the phone in the hand and it happens to be one of the most accessible handling phones that are out there right now. The display of the Galaxy S7 is a returning Super AMOLED display, coming in at Quad HD resolution, but it has high pixel densities given the 5.1-inch size. Super AMOLED displays bring pretty much everything you would expect, super punched out and highly saturated colors, and also the whites aren't necessarily true whites because, unlike an LCD, there is no backlight on here. What I did not like about the display is the fact that it requires a lot of managing on the brightness. If you were to take the brightness slider and bring it all the way down to the left, it's almost as if you're turning off the display. I typically have to have it around 40% just to keep it legible, especially when indoors. And then if I go outside, I have to crank it all the way to 100 just to make sure that it is perfectly visible. This kind of managing of the screen brightness, especially for better battery life, is just a little bit annoying and definitely a little bit more cumbersome than usual. The main addition when it comes to the display is the fact that it can be always on. When the phone is in standby, a small graphic will come up showing you either the time or a calendar or a few graphics which are predefined. Now, it may not be the most useful feature, at least not in its first iteration right now, but I do have to admit that if I'm trying to figure out what day a particular date lands on in the next month, it is nice to have the calendar on at all times. All in all, however, you still get the same quality from a Super AMOLED screen that you would expect on a Samsung device. The thing is, we've seen a lot of AMOLED displays on plenty of other devices over the last year, so it got me thinking, maybe because AMOLED is becoming so proliferated, maybe we're just more accustomed to seeing these oversaturated colors. But in performance, I have to tell you that I have been using the Exynos 8890 version of the Galaxy S7 as my daily driver. And for that matter, we have a bunch of benchmarks where we are comparing it to the Snapdragon 820 version, which I did receive recently, in order to see what the differences are between the two. But in performance, I really have had no issues with the Galaxy S7, especially considering some of the new transitions put into TouchWiz. It also makes perfect sense that Samsung have really optimized their processing package for their own software, and it definitely feels like so. And in terms of gaming, I do have one quick thing to mention. There is the water cooling that is available with the processor in the Galaxy S7, and though we're not able to really test that in real time, I can tell you that under heavy load, in my case playing Final Fantasy IX for extended periods of time, I did not feel the phone get really all that warm at all. It did not get as hot as some other devices might have, especially ones more recently, and ultimately it didn't feel uncomfortable to have the phone for extended periods of gaming. In hardware, the first thing we can talk about is a returning feature from the Galaxy S5, water and dust resistance. That means that the phone could get wet, and you just have to take a towel to it and it should be perfectly fine to go. The only place that water will actually affect is the speaker grill on the bottom. It will muddy out all of the audio, at least until it dries out. That said, however, the speaker is not really anything to boast about. It is still pretty much average, maybe just a little bit below average, considering we have plenty of better speakers with, let's say, front-facing or even dual stereo placement nowadays. Which leads us to a feature that is returning in the Galaxy S7 that I think everybody was really excited about: expandable storage. We've already taken advantage of it with a SanDisk 200GB micro SD card that we put in on day one, and even though I'm not necessarily the type of user to use up 32GB of onboard storage all that quickly, it is nice to know that when that is used up, I still have 200GB more that I could use for photos, videos, and music. And that leads us to the battery. The battery is a 3000 mAh unit inside of the Galaxy S7, and it's not removable, but with this unibody and very sleek design, that is kind of okay. On very heavy days, I'm able to get screen on time of about 3.5 hours, but if I'm using the phone more normally, I can get up to 4, maybe even 5 hours of screen on time without any problems. Nonetheless, however, if you are a more moderate user, you could probably stretch out the battery life of the Galaxy S7 to a solid 2 days. But there is still fast charging support, and the micro USB port on the bottom provides that. It does not have USB Type-C, which might feel like a step back from what's supposed to be the future of Android, but we do think that the reason for this is so that the Galaxy S7 can still tap into VR platforms like the Gear VR. But now we can talk about the camera, down to 12 megapixels from the 16 that was in the Galaxy S6 and the Note 5 after it. Now 12 megapixels might seem a little bit paltry these days, but the reason for it is actually quite sound. The pixels themselves are made bigger, 1.4 microns to be exact, and they will provide better low light performance. But before I talk about that, we do have to mention the front-facing camera. It does provide some really good quality selfies, so for those of you who want to take self-portraits more often, then the 5 megapixel shooter up front will be able to do the job. But what I really like about the front-facing camera is that it can record 2K or Quad HD video, and that will make it really good for any vloggers out there or anyone that just wants to take some videos of themselves. Other modes include slow motion, panorama, and a couple of other modes that you may or may not use. But the app itself is pretty easy to use, even if the controls might get somewhat overwhelming at times, especially if you get into the Pro mode. You do get shutter speed control, and the white balance is available in Kelvin readings. 4K video recording is available, but as is the case, or has been the case for the last year, if you use 4K video recording, you won't be able to take advantage of some of the enhancements, like for example, video stabilization. But OIS is able to help a little bit with these videos, and overall they have come out quite nice. Now, the pictures of the Galaxy S7 are going to be smaller than that of the Galaxy S6. That's because of the 12 megapixels. But you also lose some of the detail from moving away from 16 megapixels. Now, this doesn't mean that the photos aren't necessarily sharp, especially if you take it for what it is. The photos look really great. It's only when you really zoom in that you can see that not only are the lines a little bit less sharp, but there's also some noise reduction trying to compensate for that. The sharpness is a little bit lower because of noise reduction, and I actually found that the photos aren't necessarily so oversaturated. What I did like is that the HDR mode requires you to actually use it in HDR situations. It's not just going to add a bunch of saturation and bump up the shadows of every single photo. Instead, you will see a difference only when you're in high contrast situations. Otherwise, if you have HDR auto on, then you'll be able to just let the guesswork be done by the phone. There are a couple of caveats with this camera, however. If you go into more lower light situations, the phone on auto mode does tend to go warmer with the color temperature. Now that makes everything have sort of a yellowish or maybe even an orange hue on everything, so you just have to keep that in mind when using the auto mode. You can always go into the Pro mode and compensate for that using the white balance slider, of course. Ultimately, the camera of the Galaxy S7 is everything that you would want, only somewhat enhanced with the lower megapixel count and the larger pixels. That makes for better low-light performance. But the issue with that is that in broad daylight shots, in those situations when you're out and about and the lighting is perfect, you are losing a little bit of that sharpness because you're losing detail going from 4 less megapixels. But considering just how fast it is to use this camera by just double tapping the home button and then getting right into the camera, it is a very good companion to have on the daily as a camera shooter. Now we can get into software, and I do have one thing to mention before we get going. The option to turn off the app drawer in the Galaxy Labs area of the settings is not found in the Snapdragon 820 Verizon phone that I was using for testing as well. Now we don't know if this is going to be the case for all of the Galaxy S7s or the S7 Edges in the West, but we wanted to make sure that we mentioned it to you so you can take it for what it is. Now, there aren't too many new additions in the software other than a games launcher and tool. Essentially, the games launcher will allow for all of the games that you have installed to be put into one particular place. And when playing in your game, you can have a games tool that can lock the recent and back capacitive keys and provide you easy access to a few functions while within your game. Multitasking is still pretty easy on TouchWiz as well, with the multi-window capability and also the pop-up view that shrinks down most windows so you can drag it around and have overlaid windows on top of your workspace. That said, however, on a 5.1-inch screen, there's not really too much real estate to be able to do all of that. You are able to use it if you really need to, but ultimately the larger 5.5-inch S7 Edge is probably better suited for that multitasking deal. The Galaxy S7 is available now at all major carriers and will come in at the more premium price for flagships that you would typically find, either on a contract or for about $700 or more for an unlocked device. And so, there you have it, the Samsung Galaxy S7. In addressing the issues that came up in the Galaxy S6 last year, they've been able to create a smartphone that just might be accessible to pretty much anybody. Especially if you're a fan of the Galaxy S6 but you thought it was missing a few features, this just might be the perfect smartphone for you. But there are some more implications behind the Galaxy S7. In the era of micro USB, Samsung just might have shown us what the perfect smartphone could look like, and in doing so, they've been able to show us what might be the final evolution of this era of smartphones. This is a turning point for smartphone technology as we move into a world of USB Type-C and also modular designs and hopefully more out-of-the-box thinking. But until all of that gets hashed out, you just might have one of the best phones available right here in the Samsung Galaxy S7. As always, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this review of the Samsung Galaxy S7. It is an incredible device, and even if it's not necessarily unique or different compared to last year's phones, it is still one of the most reliable phones that you can probably have on the daily. Stay tuned to Android Authority for all of the coverage of the Galaxy S7, including a camera shootout that will go in more detail about the camera, and you can see that in the description below and also as part of our coverage on the Galaxy S7. Keep it tuned here for that and even more. Head on over to AndroidAuthority.com for all of the best content. Download our application, as you can see over in the corner, so you can keep up with everything Android Authority. And then from there, you can stick around and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and like all of these videos, because we are your source for all things Android.